Welcome back to Neutrality Studies, today with a guest from Bulgaria. I've got with me Captain Ivo Yotsov, who holds a PhD in international economics, was a captain in the Bulgarian Navy, and is now a professor at the Nikola Vaptsarov Naval Academy. Professor Yotsov, welcome.
Thank you very much for the possibility to be here in your neutrality studies.
I'm very happy to have you here. I'm very happy to have you because you are actually, well, you're in Bulgaria in Eastern Europe, and you are writing or working on a manuscript on new structural realism, and I would like to discuss that with you. As far as I understand, the book is not out yet. It will be out in a couple of months. But can you tell me, from your background and looking at world affairs from Bulgaria today, what does this new structural realism inform you about how the world works?
Maybe first of all, I have to explain why I have written this book. I realized that the two major concepts related to the security environment and international relations, they are not possible to explain the world we live in. The first one is liberalism, liberal institutionalism. This concept sees the countries as companies. He defines it defines the world how it should be. For example, to respect rules, to have human rights, and cannot explain the real world. Cannot explain why Russia attacked Ukraine, why U.S. Kidnapped the president of Venezuela.
I must may I just interject, because like liberal institutionalism says, like, the way that countries are structured is the way that they then also behave. So Russia invaded Ukraine because it's an autocracy, right? Because it's ruled by a dictator, therefore they go in. But that's usually where this stuff then
Yes, this is the point of view. The point of view of this concept. The second one is realism, and it has two branches: classical and structural realism, and it examines the countries as, for example, billiard balls. It is interested how they react, how they move, and interact between them. But what happens inside the balls cannot explain. And it works with pure, it counts the numbers of population, counts the ships, aircrafts, etc. And the power is related with this quantity of something. And it cannot explain why NATO lost the conflict in Afghanistan. Cannot explain with the huge GDP of US in comparison with Vietnam. The war in Vietnam was lost. From this point of view, it's cannot be explained. So one more thing is the we have to create a framework which can explain the new reality. The new reality, they are actors in international relations as private military companies, a group of hackers, for example, which and we we are in a war, in a continuous war, but without classical means to attack the opposite side. So I think the existing concept should be made more wider to include the history, the red lines, the virtual pains, the countries they feel. Okay, they are different from the point of view. They are great powers. Also, they are smaller powers, and they cannot react in the same way. So, in my point of view, the realism should be made wider.
We have a couple of IR thinkers, of course, who try to develop this concept of realism. I mean, the original realism, as it was like coined and made more or less by Morgenthau, has been going through a lot of. And Kenneth Waltz has gone through a lot of iterations, right? The most prominent one in our space is certainly John Mearsheimer, who uses what he calls offensive realism, and in his framework, one of the postulates is that security competition among states is unavoidable because they're billiard balls, so they are always on the playing field, right? So competition is unavoidable. War is avoidable if it's managed carefully, but the reason he calls it offensive is because actually states need to be assertive, especially great powers need to be assertive in order to create a balance of power, right? And not, if you give in, then, well, the other one will come and ram you through, right? So in your approach to realism, structural realism, how do you see these forces moving actually?
Actually, in my point of view, we have to examine what is going on in the balls. For example,
May I just add, because this is very different. John Mearsheimer explicitly says, I don't care what happens in the balls. It doesn't matter.
Yes.
It is the system that
yes,
pushes them.
this is the main difference. It's very important to understand what is going in, because, for example, if we see the Huntington point of view, there are different civilizations. And if you look at the point of view of, mm, what was the name? Sorry, I don't
It's
remember.
okay. It's okay.
Yes.
But let's
So
continue.
the Europe civilization as a whole is a part of, let's say, classical civilization appeared in Mediterranean, and during the Roman Empire was separated in two, Western and Eastern. So the Eastern civilization, as the countries, as my country, Bulgaria, Russia, Poland, whatever, is a little bit different from this point of view. So the behavior of the states is very well related with this background. So we cannot say, okay, we don't care about what is going in the box, because we have to answer four questions. First, who? Second, how? Third, with what kind of means will react, and at where he is doing something. It. So in this way we can say, we can classify it. We can find the red layers, the virtual pains. For example, a country which was a great empire, when a part of empire is cut it, as for example, from the Russia, the countries from Caucasus, they feel a pain as a leg was cut. Not any more part, but the pain still exists. In new structural realism is clear why Russia feels Ukraine as a part of Russian civilization. I suppose it's a lot of people, they know that the Kiev Rus is the core of Russian state. So it's very important to understand why the management of a country react in one way or different way.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. This is quite important because again, like Mearsheimer's version of realism. Of course, Mearsheimer as an analyst, as a person, will never ever ignore the beliefs and the speech acts and so on of the Russians. He actually keeps talking about this constantly, about what we hear and how also the Russian political system works. This is very very crucial. But for the theory, the point is that states necessarily behave as security competition is necessarily going on, and states behave in a way to maximize security, right, against the others. And great powers do so through several means, for instance, by fighting other great powers or trying to prevent them from ever becoming great powers, and by alliance management to make sure the others, the satellites, stay more or less in line and do not threaten the core, and issues like that, right? And he said in their theory, like, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a democracy or an autocracy or a theocracy like in Iran. I mean, once the power develops to do something, they will behave in that way. Now, what this leaves out, of course, is exactly what you're saying. The fact that different civilizations might actually not behave that way, because the case studies that the classical realists or offensive realists use are mostly those that are coming, well, straight out of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, right? And then they study how the Europeans behaved among each other, then the British, then the Americans. So it's basically one long trajectory of Western Roman Empire development, right? And breaking up and reconfiguration. And then they map that on the whole world and say, like, all of them behave like that. But it leaves out the Chinese civilization, it leaves out Eastern Roman civilization, the Russians. And your analysis now says, no. We need to look at that. The civilizational component is essential. Is it that?
Actually, my analysis said that the classical realism should be extended with this point of view. Nobody says, no, we cannot count the numbers. And actually, the power is very well related with the numbers of tanks, aircraft. Nobody says it's not like that, but there are different issues which are related with the power. The how the society, for example, is united, the will of the society. So
And what is it in your view? I mean, also, like, let's take Bulgaria as an example for like a state that is not clearly shaped, or a society that's not maybe as clearly shaped by these Western constructs as, let's say, France or the UK. But if Bulgaria, if you as a Bulgarian understand Russians in a different way and their motivations, for instance, for doing things, what is the most important aspect to understand how they, as a great power, as a great civilization, then act on the world stage today?
actually, here in Bulgaria, we have very intensive discussion in the society about the behavior with Russia. Probably you know Russia because of a war between Ottoman Empire and Russia in the end of 19th century. Bulgaria became an independent state. But in the same time, the Cyrillic alphabet was developed in Bulgaria. So we have a very close relation, the relations between nowadays Russia or Russian Empire, even more back in the history. So the the feel of the Bulgarians about Russia, it's very different, for example, from in comparison with Polish population or Western. We have here in Bulgaria Russophiles and Russophobes, two major, let's say, parties. Russophiles, they think the country should be orientated more easterly. And the Russophobes, they think the political relations with Western countries should be more closer. Now, my country is a member of NATO, European Union, etc. So somehow, let's say, the country has made a choice, some kind of choice, maybe more than 20 years ago. But anyhow, I think even the political management of the countries of the country of my country could understand the point of view of Russia very well. For example, during the World War II, the embassy of Bulgaria in Moscow and the embassy of Soviet Union in Sofia was the point of contact between Germany and Soviet Union. So I think somehow the war in Ukraine will end, and the good relations with our countries will be restored.
So you think that, the Bulgarian-Russian relationship actually, once the war ends, will improve again necessarily because of
Yes.
the proximity and
Yes, for sure.
and the cultural ties.
Yes.
May I
And
ask?
sorry, and probably our language is very close to uh, Russian. Here in Bulgaria, there are a lot of people, actually, not just from Russia, from Ukraine also, but Russian speaking Ukrainians with the beginning of the war, they live here. They feel in Bulgaria very well.
Because, like, okay, it's clear cultural proximity, right? May I ask you though, because Bulgaria is in this interesting position where, on the one hand, it was part of the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War, and it was, in that sense, it's always counted as a satellite, right? And you probably, I mean, remember those days, at least as a growing up, I suppose.
Yes.
On the other hand,
My face all.
well, I mean, I'm 40 years old and I'm still a part of the Cold War, right? It's in 1985, so anyone just a few years older probably has like active memories growing up in that situation. I mean, I keep saying we often forget just how many people were born in states that do not exist anymore. The Soviets, the Czechoslovaks, the Yugoslavs, right? A lot of people our age and even younger were born in states that don't exist anymore in Europe. But let's leave that aside. The question I want to ask is that if you think about this transition from being a Warsaw Pact member to basically being free floating, to being then becoming part of NATO, and how NATO functions today. How would you compare this transition? How would you make sense of the transition, and how would you compare being a Warsaw Pact member versus being a NATO member?
You're right. My country has a very long experience with Warsaw Pact, and we joined NATO in 2004. So more than 20 years now as a member of NATO. I was very young when the country was part of Warsaw Pact. In the Warsaw Pact, the level of integration was very high. All the military equipment was Russian. All the production of defense industry was under Russian license. So the interoperability between the armies in Warsaw Pact was very high. The procedures, everything was same, and Of course, Russian language was used as a language for communication between the different armed forces. This is the good part of it. But uh, the from the controlling point of view, Warsaw Pact was very strictly controlled by the Soviet Union. Probably you know about the doctrine Brezhnev for, let's say, limited sovereignty. According to this doctrine, the other countries, they could interact to have influence over a specific allies to re-establish the order in it. And this doctrine was developed after the, let's say, the issues in Czechoslovakia and Hungary more earlier. Actually, the level of democracy almost zero. The level of sovereignty almost zero. In NATO, it's just my point of view. The countries, they have the right to have a free choice, let's say, about equipment, about procedures in the country. And this makes, from my point of view, a huge mess. Because even now, the level of interoperability between the different armed forces, it's not so good as it should be. Probably one day will be upgraded, let's say. But yes, NATO is more the level of sovereignty and democracy in comparison with Warsaw Pact is higher.
So yeah, and when we break it back or bring it back to the theories, right? Liberalist interpretation of international relations will say NATO is a completely different animal because all its members are democracies and they all choose to join. They want to join. It's a democratic decision to join. And whereas under the Soviet rule, because those are autocracies, all other members that joined were autocracies, and they were then forced to join and integrated. And there might be a point in that, right? I mean, so even in your explanation, right, the level of integration of these two systems is just very different, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
But the realist side will say, like, these are two different flavors. It's like Coca-Cola and Pepsi. they still function they are functionally similar in the sense that they help the hegemon on either side to basically coordinate the satellites. Would you subscribe to that or not?
Well, this is a very difficult question. I cannot say. Probably, probably, even now, more. Actually, I think it's more valuable now because in several years ago, the level of controlling, I think, from hegemon was less. Actually, no, mm, it was covered.
Covered.
Yeah, it was covered. Now it's the behavior. It's I want without any shame. They say I want, and for example, the European Union. Maybe we will discuss that later. mm, Later, later discussion. But after the year of 2019, the European Union is getting more. The sovereignty of the countries is less.
Yeah.
They create a lot of rules a lot of legislation which makes the sovereignty of the countries
Less and less.
just
Now, NATO doesn't really do that as an alliance, right? It doesn't create that many rules, but it creates a lot of pressure for interoperability.
actually my point is that everything is right according to the legislation, but the reading of legislation is wrong. Because, for example, the common policy and defense of European Union is used to create specific lists against people.
Sanctions.
They do something wrong from the point of view of, for example, European Commission. The idea was to make the European Union stronger against the external threats. Threats.
Threats, yes.
Yeah. But this legislation is used to make a pressure against the people they're wrong from their point of view. You had a lot of
Yeah. I'm glad that you're bringing that topic up, because I had very interesting email exchanges on this and very interesting discussions, and one of the points is, this is a power grab, this sovereignty, the deciding on who gets sanctioned and who does not. The best philosopher who probably wrote about this is actually the Nazi philosopher Carl Schmitt, who once said, "Look, the ultimate way of states imposing sovereignty is by the power to decide who's a friend and who's an enemy, and who is on the outside, friend and enemy, and who's on the inside, the enemy. And the sanctions of the EU is a way to determine for the whole EU who is the enemy on the inside for acts that are not illegal." They didn't do anything illegal. They're just now part of the enemy group. And that's an assertion of sovereignty. And this, of course, flies in the face of, well, politicians like Viktor Orban and others who say, like, no, sovereignty is at home. It's in the nation state. And we have this contest with the EU that's just like, no. You can be administratively free, but we determine friend and enemy.
And actually, this behavior is creating now, let's say, a will of the countries, last Hungary, Czech Republic now, and Slovakia, a will, and Poland, a will to have a more distance from the other parts of European Union. And actually, the situation is getting, we say, Europe on two gears, two different speeds, let's say.
Yeah, different of Europe of different speeds. Yeah. But in this sense, you are more concerned about the politics of the European Union that creates pressures on member states than you are on the politics of NATO, because NATO creates less pressure on member states. Is that right, or am I missing?
I think yes. I think yes. I'm not any more involved in this. Okay, I was in the HQ of the Navy. I was chief of the department responsible for the integration with NATO, but it was more than 10 years ago. Now I'm not in this kind of business. So it's just as a point of view from the outside. Let's see.
But I mean, in your way, the way that you see, let's say, also Eastern European countries behave, you wrote to me that you do think that there might be a possibility for something like a Eastern European buffer zone toward the rest of NATO. Can you explain that to me a little bit? How are you envisioning a buffer of NATO states?
My point of view is that the Eastern European countries, they have a long experience with different kind of integrations. The first one we spoke about, it's a Warsaw Pact, the Warsaw Pact. It's a pure military organization. The second one is, I don't know in English, the Council for Economic Interaction. I'm not sure about.
I think CIS, the Council on
Yes.
yeah, the successor of the Warsaw Pact, right? The Council for Economic.
No, it's just economic integration of the Eastern countries. Let's say the countries under the control of Soviet Union, because Cuba and Vietnam, they were part of this economic integration.
It was always a very loose integration, right? A very loose structure.
Actually, very good integration, very high level of specialization, and we had specific currency, virtual currency as AQ in Europe Union, and it was established in late 60s. So from this point of view, this economic organization was more faster developed than Europe Union in this time. And the trade between the countries was counted in this artificial currency. Okay, the V4, it's pure, the Visegrad 4, yeah. It's a pure political organization between the countries in, let's say, in Central and Eastern.
Yeah, the Visegrad group is Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, and
No. Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary.
Ah.
Not Romania, and Bulgaria. They still have a very good political cooperation, and they react together against some political decisions in European Union as immigrant policy, for example. And the last, Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is a small European Union. Different countries, different religions, different level of economic development of the countries from the north and south in the Yugoslavia. And of course, all of those integration examples has pro and something against, which is not good. So from historical point of view, Eastern Europe has a long experience. Nowadays, in NATO and European Union, there is an initiative which is called Intermarium. The countries between Baltic Sea, Black Sea, and Adriatic Sea to be more integrated, to create transport corridors, not south, etc., to create pipes, gas pipes, etc., etc. Means create transport infrastructure. So, in my point of view, in NATO and European Union, this level of integration of the Eastern countries should be done more deeply. Okay, the point of let's say, actually, the right and left in the different countries, it's very different. But okay, the people, they think this level, the integrations in Eastern Europe should be uh, mm, more deeply because of Russia. To be more stronger, to be stronger in the front of potential attack from Russia. I don't think it's
A real threat. I mean,
yes, it's a real threat. Yeah.
and yeah, the whole idea of NATO is to deter that kind of aggression, and Bulgaria being a member, it's like, okay, that is a given, right? So, but of course, economic integration would make sense for different reasons and purposes. But how do you then think that this experience of Bulgaria and Eastern European states of having already been in mini clubs, I mean, we could call them minilateralism inside Eastern Europe. How could that experience help to create a buffer toward between Russia and Western NATO states to decrease the risk of more bloodshed in Europe?
It could be done just if NATO and Europe Union is disintegrated with the policy, with existing policy in NATO and Europe Union. That is impossible. So if this uh, event, this integration of Europe Union or NATO happens, the countries from Eastern Europe have to create such, let's say, Eastern European Union, which have to be independent from West and East. It's just my point of view, and as actually Yugoslavia was the leader of the independent countries. You know, that.
The non-aligned movement, yes.
It's actually same political behavior in international relations should be applied for these countries and coordinate between them. How I see this integration evolves. Mm, okay. For sure, some part of sovereignty have to be delegated. But I think the common policy should be delegated is the relations with outside countries, and the second infrastructure, transport infrastructure, and energetic infrastructure, electricity, gas, etc. Everything else, not as European Union, everything else, education, whatever, should be done by the governments of the countries. This will be a guarantee about the specific character of each country, about the culture of the country.
I I mean, this kind of it's very interesting that a lot of people are thinking about a post EU order in Europe, because a lot of people have this feeling that the EU is not cannot be saved anymore because it's working itself into the ground. However, I do wonder if the approach that you outlined, minilateralism, in conjunction with things like the veto, even if there isn't a way to basically, let's say NATO doesn't collapse, NATO stays, but if you had within NATO a block of countries, Visegrad countries, or maybe Eastern European NATO members, that actually together decide we want to be a buffer zone, that we want to be this de-escalatory element, and we will veto NATO decisions, as a bloc, and kind of lock in the status quo. Wouldn't that be an approach? Because we've seen actually example of in the past, in the EU between Hungary and Poland, while Poland was still under the previous government of what were their names? I forgot the nationalist party. And they were constantly using their vetoes to help also each other, because it made sure that the EU could not take one down, because you need unanimity to take one of them down. So they just keep each other's back safe, right? All of that changed when the Polish presidency and politics shifted. But if it wouldn't be thinkable to have something like that, because we've seen that, for instance, Turkey as a NATO member is actually very much a neutral player in the entire game with the Ukraine war, right? So it's not the case that a NATO member automatically must be on board of everything.
Your point of view is very good. I think should be like that. And I'm pretty sure that it will be guarantee for NATO to continue its existing, because probably after the fall of Iron Wall between Eastern and Western Europe, there was a strong discussion about the future of NATO, because the strong enemy Warsaw Pact didn't exist anymore. After that, the war against terrorism, etc., appeared and gave a reason for existing. If a part of NATO became a buffer zone, okay, it will be good for the peace, but the reason to develop more and more the defense industry, defense infrastructure will be reduced. So, in my point of view, in a future, if the issues were developed like that, in the future, also the reason for existing of NATO will disappear, because there will be not any anymore. Because of this buffer zone.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that's why NATO has no interest in that, right? Any kind of alliance needs an enemy to ally against. But the question to people like us who would like to live in peace is, so how do we break the logic? And one of the ways to break it would probably be to institutionalize buffer state policy within NATO to checkmate the warmongers. Say like, no, no, no. For instance, if Bulgaria wrote a constitutional article that says if NATO troops are to be deployed, are to be sent outside of NATO territory, that must be vetoed. Well, that would straight impact like what happens, right? That if the Bulgarian government keeps to that. So in a sense, there are ways, at least in theory, to shape the alliance politics.
it's not, it's not, you are right. It's not written in the constitution. Actually, I think no country except Austria, I think, yeah. It's written like that, but many of the countries, they react like that. For example, Turkey, you probably know during the wars in the Gulf, Persian Gulf, the Turkey, they didn't allow to use airfields, etc. They didn't participate. So the governments, they have strong power about decision for using troops during a conflict. This is the part of democracy in NATO, not like in Warsaw Pact, the general in Russia or US. NATO is deciding what the troops of Turkey, Bulgaria, whatever they will do.
This is a very interesting thought that never went through my mind, that you could try to use NATO's structure itself to start building de-escalatory principles. Of course, the current NATO, the current way in which NATO works is very much top down, but there are strong principles that would actually allow for changes in the way that NATO operates.
What to say? Yes, yes. It's in the time when we have nuclear weapons.
Hmm.
Should think about that a power which has such weapons could use them. So the politicians, they should think how to reduce the tension, not how to increase the tension. And such creation of a buffer zone, it's just one of the means to do that. And actually, the Russian point of view is exactly like that. You remember that in the end of 2021, they asked NATO to withdraw the military infrastructure behind the frontiers in the end of May.
Yeah, this will create a buffer zone. Yeah, the Russians think it this way. I agree. So yeah, this would actually be a way to start thinking about creating a common security structure, which wouldn't need to dissolve NATO. It would just need to create the strategic constraints to make sure that the deterrence is given, but offensive capabilities would be taken off the chessboard, so that you create on both sides the feeling of proper security from the other one.
Yes. Yes.
Good. I find this a fascinating.
And one point more is that we are living in a very difficult economic times from economic point of view times, and to spend money which don't create a possibility for development in the future, it's something very stupid. European Union should spend money for education, it's such for to increase the possibility uh, to shift the economy in a higher level, to spend money in investment of high technologies, whatever. Not to spend money for that.
Yeah, for human development, not for the development of the best.
Economic development, yes.
These are very good and important thoughts. Professor Yotsov, people who want to find your work, where should they go?
When the monograph is issued, will be distributed. It will be open sourced. So our uh, university press maybe is like that. The issues, the books are distributed. It will be electronically.
Once it is out, please write me again, and then I will put it into the description box below this video, and we will also alert people that the book is out. Professor Ivo Yotsov, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a Great pleasure for me. Thank you. Bye.